I grew up in Rhode Island. In the summer, we went to a very simple place called Fogland Point, which is in Rhode Island in the Sakonnet River. And there was no electricity, no really good water. We had outhouses, kerosene lamps. And so summers we lived more in the outdoors, but still this place we lived, it had a lot of rocks and sand, but not many trees. We had a vegetable garden. That was the closest we came to outdoor activities, but we were outdoors all the time. For no particular reason, in 1980, we purchased the house where I'm sitting right now in Pennellville in Brunswick. When we bought it, it was not in particularly good shape. The kitchen was just the way it is now, but other rooms needed a lot of work. So we stabilized the house over time. And during that time, we rented it first to Bowdoin students. Then the Bowdoin students survived and the house survived. So we were seasonal residents. And Pennellville at that time was really quite different. The newer houses were not here. This house was built in about 1820. And the Pennell houses, this is not a Pennell house. This was built by another sea captain. One of them's much older, but the rest of them were built maybe up to the time of 1840, 1850, something like that. It was considered a little far away and out of Brunswick and not a place that you would choose to live in the winter. It was more open. There were very few new houses. Some of the old families, there was still Carol Pennell and his wife Nancy Pennell. Nancy Pennell is still alive and she lives in Brunswick. But there were still Pennells who lived here in some of the old Pennell houses. Also, there was the poet Robert Coffin. His family lived here summers. Also, the Pennells were the same. They were living here summers only. They closed up the houses in the winter. And the Coffin family no longer owns the house, but they were living here for a number of years after we built this house. So it was the old families, the old houses, but still considered a separate community, really, from downtown Brunswick. There was also the Biet family, and I know Bob Biet is being interviewed for this. His family stayed on farming, and they were here year-round. There was concern about development and about preserving the area the way it is. Within a couple of years of the time we bought this house, the Nasitas built a house next door, and the other houses along Pennell Way were built. People were beginning to buy the older houses and put them in good shape and live in them year-round. But there wasn't a lot of focus, particularly on the meadow at that time. There was a landowner, Carl Alvord, who owned a great deal of land out here. I got a call one day from Bill Bodwell and another neighbor, Tom Black, and they said, somebody's going to build a house on the meadow, and we'd like to know if you would consider, instead of them building on the meadow, if you would consider letting them build on your land, selling them some of your land and letting them build there. All this was happening fairly quickly, and I didn't have too much time to think about it. So I said no. I said, I don't think I want to sell any of our land to have something built on it. The next summer when I came here to spend the summer, there was a house going up on that land, so I went over to see what was going on. And that was when I met Jack Ailey, who will continue through this story until the end. And so Jack Ailey was by himself over there. He was building his house by himself. Somebody else had done the basement and some of the structure, but he was filling it all in. And also I met his wife, Laurel, and the two of them have been lifelong friends of ours. That was kind of the beginning of people thinking about the meadow. By that time, new houses were built, the Nasita house next door and a few more houses down there. Everybody looked out at the meadow, and people began to be concerned about it. It was probably about 1983 that we bought 3 acres of land right across from our front door just to protect that area from having houses built right up close to our house. And the whole meadow is about 17 acres. So we owned 3 acres. Jack Ailey owned, I don't know what they owned, a couple of acres maybe. I think that the series of events got people to thinking about saving the meadow. Bob and Mary Biet did not live here at that time, but Carl Alvord being Mary's father, they visited quite a bit. We have a Pennellville party every year, and Bob Biet made a talk at that Pennellville party saying that we should all be trying to think of ways to preserve the meadow. And Bob is a very good speaker and made a very effective talk. We were here for that summer, but then we were back in Washington for the winter. So I wasn't here when these things were happening. But I did get some telephone calls and some letters from Jan Bodwell that they were thinking of protecting the meadow in some way, doing something that would save the meadow from any further construction. Meanwhile, because of a family property we owned in the Mount Desert area, a representative of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust visited me in Washington and spent a long time explaining to me about conservation easements. The Maine Coast Heritage Trust was fairly new at that time. He was in their Mount Desert office, and so he was seeing different people in Washington who owned properties up there to see if he could persuade them to consider preserving their land. So I had a preview of what eventually happened in Pennellville. The next time we were back, and so probably I'm in the summer maybe of 1984. By that time, Bob Biet and Jan Bodwell had pursued this idea. Jan was here on the spot. Bob was living in the Boston suburbs. And Bob was in contact with Carl Alvord. He kept that means of communication open with his father-in-law, who was the owner of acres and acres of land out here. The meadow was just one small part of what he owned. They had engaged a lawyer. They had a plan to engage the neighbors, talk to the neighbors one by one, and Jan did all this. Bob was here sometimes, but not too much. But still, he kept the line of communication open to his father-in-law. So Jan sat down and said, would we be interested in participating, which we thought the overall plan was a good idea, but would we put our 3 acres into the meadow? And my first response was, no, I don't think we want to do that, because we control it the way it is now. If we gave it up, we wouldn't know what would happen to it. But Jan was very persuasive, and she was very well informed and a very lovely woman. And she was also a realtor. And so she had the real estate way of explaining things to you. It only took about 15 minutes, and I realized that to include our 3 acres was obviously the way to go. Everybody would share the cost. It would involve the neighbors. It would preserve the entire meadow instead of just our 3 acres. So nobody was thinking about a land trust at that moment. We were too ignorant to know. I mean, we weren't ignorant. We just hadn't got to that point. All those people who were interested in shares, either their land abutted the meadow or they had a view of the meadow. They were very close by. I mean, almost all the families are within eyesight of our front window here. The process of creating the easement and having everybody pay and sign and all the legal work, Jan was doing all that, and it wasn't easy because nobody had ever done a conservation easement before, and she could explain it to people and then get them to participate. There were other people involved in the creation of the land trust who didn't have anything to do here. I just know that there was Marilyn and Warren Dwyer. And these were probably going along through between 1985 and 1990. There was a group of people, and we were not participating except as members in any of this, but there was a lot of work done by Jack and Laurel, his wife, and they would have art auctions and anything to raise money for the land trust. And I think the Dwyers put quite a bit of money into it. And then Bob and Mary Biet. Bob probably told you about the garden tours. There were a lot of people who really worked hard once the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust was created to keep it going in those first years. And Jack, who you'll see when you meet him, is a very enthusiastic personality, and he's big, he's got a loud voice, he makes a big impression when you meet him. He worked really hard. Everybody worked. And I can't say we worked really hard because we weren't here. They all worked really hard to get the land trust going. Their commitment to protecting important natural areas, that's what they're doing now. I mean, they're involved in a lot of other things, but that's still their top priority. I was just thinking today about the other easements that came along. One was called the Schofield Preserve that was owned by a member of the Schofield family, and I think she donated it. And then there was also Bradley Pond Farm, which was much bigger. And that was really exciting. And I think that, and Jack was, he worked on that for a long time. A beautiful spot. They built a trail, so that was a real big project for them. And then it wasn't too long, and I'm sure Jack and Tom Settlemeyer are going to tell you all the details about this. Crystal Spring Farm was available, and that was major. But it was touch and go as to whether somebody else might buy it, and then they had to commit to it, and it was a lot of money, and they did fundraising. I realized that they're much more involved with community activities. And I was on the board when some of those started, and the community garden and the farmers market. Every Saturday morning, they had a little table that said Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust on it, and the farmers market had maybe 5 or 6 booths. So there would be some land trust presence over there at the market. And at that time, there was plenty of parking, plenty of space for the booths. But then the market really took off. There was a lot of discussion about moving the market to someplace else because the parking was so difficult. But then it turned out that the people who shop at that market, they want to shop because it's at the farm. It was going to the farm and getting, buying this stuff. So it stayed at the farm. It took a lot of commitment on the part of the people who were here to keep it going. But then it just exploded with success. It's part of a kind of a constellation of activities around that major purchase of Crystal Spring Farm that was a very courageous commitment on the part of a struggling little land trust. When Jack retired about 2005, Angela, who had been on the board and was pretty experienced, became the executive director. She was very committed to the community idea, and we had probably already started the community garden at that time. And I was kind of doubtful about at first that the land trust was going to be focusing too much on community activities. Then I really changed my mind because Angela has such a sure touch on so many things that seem to work out to the benefit of everybody, both the land trust and to the recipients of whatever this particular program would be. They're sticking with acquisition of land that's important for fighting off climate change or for mitigating climate change, as well as land that's farmed maybe or privately owned and nobody ever goes on it. And I think that's a really valuable program aspect too, that we have to have land that's just protected for its own importance. I was reading Maine is the most forested state in the United States. And to protect some of those woodlands with no access at all, I think is essential. I graduated from college in 1960, and I took a course in 1956 or 7 in conservation. It wasn't that great a course, but it did introduce way back then the idea of protecting land and preserving natural resources. And I've just had that ever since. Taking care of trees and how to manage different things in the woods, growing blueberries, all kinds of things. To figure out how to live, even if it's your career or just how you live, is to try to live in a way that doesn't damage the environment too much.